Good morning. Welcome to the 594th Biweekly Assemblies of New Asia College of CUHK, 2016 to 2017. We will now sing the college anthem to commence the assembly. Please stand up. Please be seated. Students, please be reminded that you must punctually attend the biweekly assemblies and colloquia which you have registered for. Students, admitted in 2012 to 2013 must register for and attend 2 biweekly assemblies, while students admitted in other academic years must register for and attend 3 biweekly assemblies, or 2 biweekly assemblies plus 1 student lunch or dinner colloquium. Should students fail to register for assemblies or have any inquiries on the attendance, please contact the Dean of Students' Office. Before entering the hall, please make sure that your attendance is successfully recorded by the card reader. A successful record is signified with a beep sound and green notification light. Students can check your attendance record on the Registration and Attendance System, RAS, after 4 p.m. on the next working day after the biweekly assembly. The 594th Assembly of New Asia College of CUHK 2016 to 2017 will start now. Today's assembly is the first lecture on the 30th Qing Lecture on History and Culture of New Asia College. We are pleased to invite Professor Benjamin Elman from Princeton University sharing with us on his research. We are also pleased to have Professor Henry Wong, our college head, to introduce the speaker and to be our moderator. Now, may we invite Professor Elman and Professor Wong to come up to the stage. Professor Elman, please. Professor Wong, please.
Dear guests, staff, and students, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Benjamin Elman, Speaker of the 30th Qianlong Lecture in History and Culture. Professor Elman is Professor of East Asian Studies and History, and also the Gordon Wu Class of 58 Professor of Chinese Studies at Princeton University. Professor Elman received his PhD degree in Oriental Studies from the University of Pennsylvania in 1980 and joined the faculty of Princeton in the year 2002. Before Professor Elman came to Princeton, he had taught in many universities like University of Michigan, Rice University and University of California in Los Angeles. His teaching and research fields include Chinese intellectual and cultural history, history of science in China, history of education in late imperial China, and Sino-Japanese cultural history. He is a prolific author, and his publications include From Philosophy to Philology, Casteism, Politics and Kingship, A Cultural History of Civil Examinations in Late Imperial China. Some of his works have been translated into Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. One of his current research areas is on the Sino-Japanese and Korean cultural history, which is in fact the topic of his second lecture to be delivered tomorrow at the Hong Kong Central Library. Now, in my own capacity as a scientist, I must commend Professor Elman for his contributions to the history of science. In addition, Professor Elman's publications are well recognized by many historians and scholars in other disciplines. And this morning, the lecture title of Professor Elman is A Late Chosŏn Korean Polymath, Chォng-hŭi, and Qing Dynasty Qianlong Jiaqing era scholarship. Let's welcome Professor Elman with a big hand. Thank you so much.
No, it's okay. Thank you. 大家好。对不起，我今天是要用英文讲了，但是其他的时候我也可以用中文的，所以我希望是有问题的话，用英文、中文的都可以了。我们可以，我不一定会回答了，可是我可以试试看。那我现在开始用英文的。Thank you very much for inviting me to attend your 新亚书院 monthly meeting. I understand now why there are so many of you here. I thought you were all here for me, but you are here because you have to be here. And you are part of the 新亚书院精神. So I'm very pleased that I'm participating in this event, and I hope that I will be able to say a few useful things for you while I talk about this important Kim Chォng-hŭi from Korea. As some of you may know, Princeton is very old-fashioned and requires all undergraduates to complete a senior project, either as a thesis or some sort of science project or some sort of humanities or social science project. And so very often we have to show students how to think like a historian, and today I'm going to start with some materials that hopefully you can see where our students at Princeton learn how to think like a historian, even if they will not become historians themselves. We try to make sure they understand how historians think, and how they marshal evidence, and how they use sources in many, many different kinds of languages. So today's discussion is in many ways an effort to sort of say how we go about looking at Chosŏn and Qing dynasty relations in the 18th century, and we will see that they were very warm in the 18th century. With hindsight, we can see, of course, that today's relations between Korea, China, Japan, and Russia and other places are not so peaceful, that the Korea China-Japan relationship is very complicated because of northern Korea and southern Korea, Chosŏn and Hanguo. So I want you to see in some ways the 18th century is a much more peaceful time, a much more positive time for relations between China and the Korean peninsula, particularly the Chosŏn dynasty and the Qing dynasty. Kim Chォng-hŭi was a remarkable man. He was a remarkable scholar, and he visited it for many, many times. He came to China, particularly Yanjing, Beijing, to visit with literati and also with the officials of the Qing dynasty. The first thing historians begin with is sources, of course. There's very little you can do without sources, and we have, fortunately, a collection of Chosŏn Dynasty materials written in Chinese for the most part that were prepared under the Yanxinglu Quanji. And these materials are very, very important. They've been collected together and republished. And as you know, until 1900, many Korean scholars and women scholars also learned Chinese and learned to write in Hangul, the Chinese language, and memorize the language very well. And today we will be talking about the exchanges in language and sources between Chinese and Korean scholars. So the Yanxinglu Shangkan Songbu Ban is a collection of materials of 100 volumes, all online and searchable. So these are remarkable sources that can be used. Then we have the Hanguo Hanwen Yanxing Wenxian Xuanbian in 30 volumes with Fudan University published as well. The Koreans have also published these materials. Hanguo Wenji Tsongkan is also available and searchable in 350 volumes. So this is a sizable amount of information and material to use for literature, for politics, for economy, for statecraft in this period of time. And a number of people have been making use of this material in these many volumes, particularly the Japanese scholar Fuma Susumu, Fuma Jin, who wrote a very important book on Zhongguo Dong Asia 外文交流史的研究, and is a very important source. Also, Fuma wrote another work on Chaoshen Yanxing Shi. These are the envoys to China with Chaoshen Tongxin Shi. These were, in many ways, the translators. So the translators in Korea knew Chinese and would act as the translators for their official ministries, for their official people and their sources. Fujitsuka Chikashi later became very famous for becoming a leader in Korea of Korean studies when Korea was part of the colony of Japan, as Taiwan was at that time, and as they tried to make Hong Kong that way as well in the Second World War. So Fujitsuka Chikashi will be part of the story, even though he's a great scholar. His major book is translated into Chinese. Qingxiao Wenhua Dongchuan no Yanzhou has been available for many, many years, and he and his friends, his relatives, wrote also Nichi Seishin no Bunka Koryo, Jiao were very, very important works at that time. And so you can see that there's a sizable amount of information that tells us a great deal about China and Korean relationships in the 18th century. So in many ways, I've picked out one story, the story of Kim Chong-hŭi, to show you what is available in sources like these particular sources. But the first thing we want our undergraduates to do when they think about history is to know the sources, know the problems of the sources, the languages of the sources, and to use them and edit them critically for their particular frameworks. We say often that historians use facts to tell lies, and they use lies to tell the truth, depending on the political context that is involved at that period of time. So in this context, history is a very important feature of doing research in Sino-Korean relationships in the 18th century. This is a painting by the very famous Qing painter and scholar Zhu Henian, who wrote this, who painted this farewell to Kim Chong-hŭi when he came to China, Yanjing, to Beijing in 1809. On a visit representing the Chosŏn dynasty to the Qing dynasty. And you can see in this particular painting that Kim Chong-hŭi is wearing the very funny Korean hat. The hat is something Chinese wore in the Han and Tang dynasties, but this maintained a tradition in the Korean world in that period of time. And in this context, Wen Fanggang and Ran Yuan, two very famous Qing scholars, met and sent off Kim Chong-hŭi, who was a pioneering delegate coming to China in the early 19th century. And so Kim Chong-hŭi got to see China at the end of the Qianlong period and the beginning of the Jiaqing period, roughly 20 years before the Opium War. He later got to see Wei Yuan's Haiguo Tuzhi, the maritime gazetteers, and he saw other materials in the 1830s and 1840s leading up to the Opium War. So Kim Chong-hŭi had a very good knowledge of Chinese and Chinese culture culture and values, and he grew to be very good friends with Wang Fanggang and Ran Yuan. He wrote beautiful poetry. He is a great calligrapher, and he was a wunderkind as a child in writing poetry and using different forms of press to present his ideas. So here we see Zhu Henian painting the situation of sending Kim Chong-hui back to China in 1810 after he'd arrived in 1809. One of his teachers was Pak Zhiga, Bu Qijia, who came to China for the first time in 1780. He was not a Liangban. He was a Pingmin, a common person, because his mother was a concubine, and so he himself could not have royal status. Kim Chong-hui came from the royal family. The kings were his nephews. The kings also were his superiors, brothers, and the like as well. So in this context, we see Kim Chong-hui as an aristocrat, a Liangban, studying at the feet of Pak Zhiga. Pak Zhiga was not a Yangban, but he was a very famous scholar, and in many ways, Kim Chong-hui grew to understand China in the late Qianlong, early Jiaqing period because of Pak Zhiga's very, very profound scholarship and learning in his various books. The Zhenwei Geji was something that was a very prominent piece of work for Pak Zhiga and many others to study the Hall of Pine Needles. And we'll see that the metaphor of pine trees and pine needles is a very, very important metaphor for the expression of political dissent, for the expression of politics and ideas in this period of time, both in China and in Korea in this period of time. Chen Zan was a very not-so-famous scholar from Zhejiang who passed the provincial examination in the beginning of the Jiaqing reign. He failed, however, on the 1801 Hui Shilu, the metropolitan examination. But he met Pak Zhiga by going to the Liulichang in Beijing. The Liulichang used to be a glass factory. It turned into a wonderful antiques market. Rare books were available there. They still are. And in many ways, like today when Korean students and Chinese students gather at the Liulichang to exchange materials and views, similarly at this time, Chen Zan was walking through the Liulichang and he met Pak Zhiga in 1801, the same year he was failing the Hui Shilu examination. And he spent a long time getting to know Pak Zhiga, and the two of them saw that they had much in common. And Chen Zan got Pak Zhiga's work published in China in the 19th century. So many Chinese knew that Pak Zhiga, Kim Chong-hui, and the others were very learned scholars from Korea who understood China very, very well. This is also a period of dark corruption. At the end of the Qianlong reign and then the beginning of the Jiaqing reign, Heshen had taken power in Beijing and elsewhere and controlled the financial resources of the dynasty. I will not go over this a great deal, but I will say that this was the background for Kim Chong-hui coming to China, and he knew about the problems with Heshen, and he also wrote about the problems of how great the Qianlong reign was, except for Heshen's corrupt influence in this period of time. And this became part of the exchange between Korean officials and their Chinese counterparts. They knew that both sides had royal kings and emperors, and also they had relatives and princesses and queens that got in the way of normal affairs and made it very difficult to run the states properly. So this will be ironic because in many ways Pak Zhiga will be under house arrest, will go into exile in the 1830s and 1840s because of his relationships with his own family, with his own royal lineage and the like. So this situation with Heshen was known to the Koreans. They understood the situation, and in many ways the Chinese sort of admitted their own anger and disgust with what was happening. But later when the same thing happened in Korea, we could see that Pak Zhiga began to represent the situation in Korea in indirect painting tones. He would paint a painting that his friend took to China to commiserate with him in the failures of good men to achieve success in government. This was their voice of dissent. And so lurking behind this situation in China was an attack and criticism on Heshen, and also at this time was the critique of the kings of the Chosån Dynasty, who were also corrupt and not willing to open Korea to the Protestants and Christians who were coming to Korea in the 18th and 19th centuries in this period of time. These are just a list of the charges against Chosŏn. I don't want to go into any detail. Historians may not take all these facts for granted, but it's certainly a very strong case against Chosŏn that he had more money than the state had. He had more money than Qianlong had. He had more houses and women and coins and values than Qianlong had as well. And yet Qianlong had made Chosŏn the powerful minister, the daxue shi in the court at that period of time. I give you simply this is overkill. No one could have had as much of this. Nobody could have controlled all these resources, but these were the charges that were placed against Chosŏn in this period of time. And it began to be a very dark period, the late Qianlong period, that many Chinese covered up, but Koreans knew about and understood because they were coming to Yanjing, to Beijing in this period of time. So we have the property being estimated at 1.1 million taels of silver. That's much more than the entire dynasty had under the Qianlong court. This is the residence of the Chosŏn, which was later put under mothballs, and one of the princes of the Manchu reign later lived in this area in the 19th century, and it is today open in the northwestern areas of Chosŏn's mansion, which was used by Prince Gong in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s during and after the Taiping Rebellion. So we can begin to see that in terms of housing, in terms of wealth and power, Chosŏn left a huge legacy, and I think many of you know that he was forced to commit suicide by the succeeding Jiaqing emperor in the late 18th century. Hong Liangji was a very prominent scholar who came from Changzhou, and Pak Zhige got to know him very well, and he ultimately placed a very, very positive review of Hong Liangji in his account written and published in Korea. Pak Zhige argued that Hong Liangji, who had been exiled by the Qianlong emperor and exiled by the Jiaqing emperor later on, had been the first to attack the corruption of the time and had used the Gongyang Zhuan, the Gongyang commentary, to attack the court and the elites of that time. And the Pak Zhige was praising Hong Liangji for his use of the classics to be critical of the political world at that time. Hong Liangji was part of the Changzhou Xiepai, the Changzhou school that was very, very well known and attached to Liu Fenglu and the Liu family and to Zhuang Cunyu and others of the Zhuang family in this area. And we now see that Hong Liangji and others had contacts with Pak Zhige, and they also had contacts with Kim Chong-hŭi in this period of time to understand the fate of a minister in a corrupt political environment. Later, we see that Kim Chong-hŭi, when he was placed under exile, continued his scholarship. And this is a scroll of his painting and preparation of Chinese calligraphy. And you can see that he was very historically minded. He was influenced by Ran Yuan, who was interested in ancient Zhuanshu and ancient Lishu, regular script, from that period of time. And this was the effort to mimic the writing of the Han Dynasty when Korea became part of the empire in the northern parts of Korea. And this was his view, almost archaeologically reproducing the writing of the sages, the writings of the Han officers and before in this period of time. In China, Chen Dian, a nephew of Chen Daxin, and Deng Shiru, a very famous calligrapher, were also doing this kind of calligraphy to make Li Shu the historical calligraphy that was acceptable at this period of time, and to attack Zhuanshu, particularly as being in many ways more difficult historically to unravel, and to be very critical of Xingshu and Caoshu as figments of the imaginations of many who tried to figure out what calligraphy really meant. So here we have the Chusa style, the Choshi Ti that Kim Chong-hŭi used to express his ideas in calligraphy. In this period of time when Kim Chong-hŭi went into exile, because his family had in many ways exiled him, he painted a very famous scape, a winterscape, called the Suihantu, the Seihando, which he painted in 1844 while in exile in 1840. What was ironic, of course, was having been to China and seen China under Chosŏn, he returned to Korea and he saw Korea, the Chosŏn dynasty, in many ways treat him unfairly and to try to keep him from getting engaged in politics. So in this context, Kim Chong-hŭi, the teacher, became in many ways the patron of Yi Sang-jok, who was the translator. And we have the inversion of normal relationships between the Yangban elite and the translators who were simply pingmin, normal human beings without special categories of birth. And Yi Sang-jok was able to visit China many times and transmit Kim Chong-hui's views to his colleagues back in China. And so they used these materials to write back and forth, to discuss the situation. Before they commiserated about Ye Heshan, here we have them commiserating about Kim Chong-hui going under house arrest during the period of the early 19th century. The painting that Kim Chong-hui prepared is straightforwardly an interesting painting of a small cottage where he lived as a very humble exile, and these pine trees growing over his subtle living space, sort of reaching for the skies. And we can see in this situation that the pine tree is a symbol of aspirations in painting, a symbol of hopes and dreams, and also using the voice of painting to, in many ways, voice views of dissent in this context. He could have been said to say, using this for political purposes, but he could reply and say, it's only a painting. 这是一个画，没有什么意义的。And so that was one of the advantages of using these kinds of ways of communicating ideas, that these trees stood for something more than just being trees. They stood for ideals and values in this period of time. And you can see that when Yi Sang-jok took this painting and epitaph, this writing material, to China in the 1840s, he took this so that his Chinese Qing friends could see his painting and see his words, and he invited them to add words as colophons to his own painting, to his own findings. And so in many ways, he was soliciting opinion in China through his translating student, and brought the materials back and forth between the Chosån Yangban and also the Qing dynasty figures that they contacted. This is the trees, the pine trees in the royal shrine, the Zongmiao, later on in Chosån. These are not the original trees, of course, but this is how they were redone to mimic the originals. And if we put them together with the painting, we can see that they're very similar in the natural forms of the pine trees to the way that Kim Chong-hui saw them in his own view. And so we can see that he was in many ways writing and talking through these trees for his higher views of what civil officials, Yangban in office, should do. And he was thankful that his student was able to transmit these materials as paintings, as writings to his colleagues in China. This was a covert exchange. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't illegal, but it was done back and forth. And so in many ways we have this winterscape, Seihando, surviving in the 18th and 19th centuries as a kind of entry into a world of dissent in this period of time. This use of paintings to express trees as symbolic forces is beginning to be very important in a very famous Luo Chuan painting called Gumu Hanyatu, the crows in old trees, which had been painted in the southern Song period. And we can see that the crows are flying around, eating whatever they can, and the territory looks empty and very difficult. There are some pheasants eating on the ground in the middle of the snow. These are the people, and then these are the Mongols and other groups oppressing China, oppressing the materials at that time. It's not literally that, but you can read into these paintings certain kinds of symbolics that they represent the age of their time as well. And this is what Kim Chong-hui was in many ways following from Luo Zhiquan and other painters of the Songming period, who used paintings as a form of talking about what it had been like under the Mongols, and then later what it had been like under the other groups, ostensibly the Manchus and others as well. Ming loyalism had been very, very important in Korea. During Ming loyalism of the late 19th century, the late 16th century, the Japanese had invaded Korea in the 1590s, and the Ming dynasty had come to the aid of the Chosŏn dynasty against the Japanese coming under Hideyoshi's leadership. And in the 1590s, they were able to force the Japanese out of the Korean Peninsula and force them back to the Japanese islands, and to set up a kind of a sakoku, suoguo, semi-closed environment for the Japanese in the 1590s. In my talk that I'll give tomorrow, I'll carry the story further to the 1890s, the Jiao Zhanzhang, compared to the Imjin War with the Koreans in the 1590s. But here we can see that the Koreans were very thankful in the 16th century that the Ming Dynasty had come to help save the Chosŏn from the Japanese invasion. And here, if you can see, I'm not sure it's as clear as it should be, but you can see engraved still in the stones is the Daming Tiandi. And then it has Chongzhan reign and gives the dates and things like that. This was in the middle of the 19th century when it would have been illegal under the Manchu regime to say anything positive about the Manchus or to give a date. But the Koreans were using the late Ming dates as their official dates as late as the middle of the 19th century. So it would be, for example, the period of time that we have as Chongzhan 150年. Of course, Chongzhan had long since died, but Koreans would use it as if Chongzhan was still alive. In this context. And here is one of the shrines for the Huayang Shuyan, which gave a special presence and place to the role of the Ming Dynasty in salvaging and saving the Chosŏn Dynasty from the invasion of the Japanese. In the 19th century, the story is very different. Japan colonizes Korea, forces Taiwan to become a colony, and also forces the Chinese to give up much of the areas of Manchuria in that later period as well. So if we look at the period from the 1590s to the 1890s, as I will do tomorrow, we can see that this world of Ming loyalism and the triumph of the Ming Dynasty and the Koreans in the Chosŏn over Japan is something we have forgotten, and the Imjin War has been very much forgotten in our historical record as well. What's interesting is, in the midst of this period of time, Lee Song-jok, remember, is the translator, and he's still going to China many, many times to accompany official missions, and he brings back books for Kim to read at this period of time. And some of the books he brings are by Yun Jing, a Changzhou scholar who writes the great Da Yun Shanfang Ji about statecraft. He brings back Wei Yuan's Haiguo Tu and also brings back Wei Yuan's Huang Chao Jingshi Wen Bian. These are all statecraft books about politics, already in the 1820s and 1830s. And what is happening is Lee Sang-gok is bringing this back for Kim Chong-hŭi to read and to see what's happening in the official circles of the Qing dynasty in the 19th century. So in many ways, this is the voice of reformism that continues to form and be very important in this period of time from the 1820s to the 1850s. And we see that this is called an era of Bianfa Sixiang. The Bianfa Sixiang is not only Wei Yuan and the Haiguo Tu, and not only the Qing dynasty, it is also the Chosŏn effort for reform that begins in this period of time. And Kim Chong-hŭi's students in Korea will be leaders of the reformist movements that begin to grow in the 1850s and 1860s to try to bring more important reforms in government at this period of time. And you can see that Kim Chong-hŭi, even though he was in exile, he was still keeping up with the times, and his student, Lee Sang-jok, was bringing materials for him to read, and the books he was bringing were the books that we would have chosen to read, like Wei Yuan, like Yun Jing, and others who wrote about this period in a particular period of time. Note the importance of the Changzhou school. The Changzhou Jinwenxue Pai, the New Text school at this period of time was particularly important, and Yun Jing and others were very, very important members of this group. Wei Yuan was a student of Liu Fenglu, remember, and Liu Fenglu had been from the Changzhou family in Jinwenxue New Text in this period of time. So remarkably, the New Text movements of the Qing dynasty in Changzhou and elsewhere were transmitted to Korea. You'll remember that they described Hong Liangji as a great Gongyang scholar, a scholar of the New Text views of politics and society in this period of time, and it was being transformed in other places as well. This is an example of the Changzhou New Text people that got to know much of the people that were associated with this. Zhuang Shouqi, Zhao Zhenzuo, were all from Changzhou and were part of the rise of the literati in the period before and after the Opium War. And here we see Zhao Zhenzuo writing a very, very important epitaph, a short writing adding on to this to talk about how worthless people simply like refined things. The Junzi refines and sticks with the solid and the trustworthy. The trees have no plans, but why should they grow so tall? In many ways justifying the plant as a symbol of the political hopes of this period of time. So in terms of Changzhou, not only was Jinwenxue very important, but Changzhou writing in Guwen, ancient-style prose, and in different kinds of lyric poetry, ci, were also written in this period of time, and very influential politically in this aftermath after Qianlong, into Jiaqing, into the Daoguang period, going into the Taiping Rebellion. So this kind of exchange was going on very quietly through these writings and paintings, and was not a public event in court, but nonetheless we can see that at the interstices of the society of people in government and of people living at home away from government, that there was room for dissent, there was room for alternate views, and that they could exchange these views in this period of time. What's interesting in this context is that Kim Chong-hui's painting, The Winterscape, was later taken by the Japanese in the 20th century when they colonized Japan as part of their inheritance from the Koreans. So they took Kim Chong-hui's Seihando, and put it in the hands of the Chikashi, Fujitsuka Chikashi family, who kept it as an heirloom, sort of indicating the Japanese control of the Koreans by having their outstanding artwork under control of the Japanese. And so this Winterscape began to leave the context of the Heshan and early 19th century difficulty and began to have a different story in the 20th century. We find that paintings sometimes, when they are appropriated in one century, then later than an earlier borrowing, we see the meanings begin to change. And here, the meanings of the Seihando of Kong Xianhui was no longer simply a voice against Korean and Chinese corruption. It was a voice now of wonderful painting that was painting huts and trees with exquisite expertise, and the Japanese could buy and use these materials in a way to show their control over Koreans and Korean culture. The Koreans were not happy about this, of course. And so they tried for the longest period of time to buy the paintings of Kim Chong-hui back. But Fujitsuka and others refused to do so until the 1940s. And in 1944, the Fujitsuka Chikashi then more or less sold the painting back to a Korean art collector. And fortunately, it was brought back to Korea just before Tokyo was firebombed by the American Air Force. And much of Chikashi's holdings were destroyed, but fortunately Kim Chong-hui's paintings survived and became part of a new story of Korean liberation from the Japanese. And so the painting took on two voices. The initial voice was the dangers of being an official in a corrupt age, Heshan, or the equivalent in Korea. And now it became a sign of a great landscape of Korean countryside that now was being repatriated to the Koreans in the 1940s and in 1947, and Seihando became a voice of Korean nationalism. Again, we see that the paintings can take on views that, of course, Kim Chong-hui couldn't have realized, couldn't have seen himself, but yet the painting went on to have a new life. And if you visit Korea and you go to the Seoul Museum there, the Museum of Art and Painting, you'll see that Kim Chong-hui's painting is there and put in a very prominent place with this view of trading in, a new meaning in the 20th century from an old meaning in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the midst of this, the final comment I will make is that this was also a period of scholarship and change in views of the classics, and that Kim Chong-hui was influenced by Ran Yuan, influenced by the Han Xue, the Han learning people, influenced by Kao Zhang Xue, evidential learning, and influenced by Gu Wen Xue in writing ancient words. And so these views became, in many ways, Xue Shu Bian, scholarly and academic debates about what to do to preserve the teachings of the classics. And so in one situation, you hold fast to your teacher's words, shou shi shuo. You penetrate the lesser learning, philology, tong xiao xue, xungu, zhuan jie, and borrowed characters, and you will understand the principles of the heavenly masters and rulers in this situation. You have to use the liujing, the 6 forms of writing the classics, follow the characters, follow the sound, and then from that reconstruct the classics. You allow a new way to interpret the views of the ancient masters, and this is a revival of Han learning, Hanxue and Gaozhangxue in this period of time. I don't have a great deal of time to go into this, but the conclusion is simply to say that in terms of the ancient Jaffa, the old schools, if they are clear, then our classical learning will be clear. If our Jaffa, if our schools are lost, then our classics are lost as well. And so this is the Shi Shi Chou Shi theories of the Gaozhong scholars in the late 18th, early 19th centuries that we associate with Ran Yuan, with Qian Daxin, and others in this period of time. And we can see that in many ways what was going on here was that Kim Chong-hŭi was under the influence of Ran Yuan and other leading Gaozhong scholars in Korea to put forward these views from the Chinese in that period of time. And I say this because very often these new views of the Koreans in the late 19th century are overlooked in favor of the traditional views of Neo-Confucianism and other views of politics and morality at that period of time. That's as far as I want to go today, but I hope that many of you, if you go to Korea and visit, that you can see Kim Chong-hŭi's painting in the National Museum, and you can understand the context and what it means in the context of communication with China from Korea, in context of relations with Japan in the colonial age. Thank you very much for your time.
Let us express our gratitude to Professor Elman for his wonderful lecture with a round of applause. Now, may we invite Professor Wong to hold the Q&A section. Professor Elman, please. Professor Wong, please. Students, please feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Elman, for a very informative lecture, and Professor Elman is happy to answer questions in English as well as in Mandarin. So, please. Yes, please. There's a mic over there.
Hi, Professor Elman. When you talk about the Seihan Do by Kim Chong-hŭi, you mentioned that he's influenced by the Chinese painter Luo Zhichuan. But he's from Southern Song period, Southern Song dynasty. And I know that the China's influence on Korean art started as early as Han Dynasty. I want to know that if that influence is continuous from Han Dynasty through Qing Dynasty, and why Kim Chong-hŭi is influenced by a Southern Song dynasty painter rather than Ming or Qing dynasty painters. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I don't think Kim Chong-hŭi actually saw the Song paintings that I'm describing, but I think in many ways there had been a tradition of painting in the Song and Yuan period that used trees as pine trees as ways of reflecting upon the Mongol era, and they became a very popular way of describing reality in the Southern Song. I think Kim Chong-hŭi knew about that and wrote about it, but I don't think he saw the actual paintings that I was bringing forward to you. I'm just sort of indicating to you that the Koreans were carrying on a tradition that they themselves were part of, that they themselves used these trees to symbolize their hopes and aspirations, and to also their disappointments through the winter when there were no leaves, and the only thing that stood was the pine. Everything else was gone away. So I think in that context, the citations and references to the Song and the Ming are clear. The Ming and the Qing are a touchy case, because if you focus too much on the Ming and the Qing, you have the Qing dynasty in your face. And I think in that context, they were avoiding having the Qing dynasty make it impossible for Kim Chong-hŭi's students to go back to China to act as translators and to work backwards and forwards. So I think they exchanged conversations about the Ming and the Qing, but they didn't dare use Ming and Qing paintings from the late Ming into the early Qing to represent those ideas. The Song was sufficiently historicized that you could do it without people being suspicious or overly suspicious or saying, that was a long time ago. It has nothing to do with us today, when it really does. So I think they had to be careful about Ming-Qing materials. You could see the references to the Southern Ming in that very famous academy where they put the last dynasty of the Ming dynasty as their ideal. That was something that they did themselves in secret. The Qing never knew about it, the Manchus never knew about it, and it was only later in the 19th and 20th centuries that we have been able to resurrect and see these voices of dissent in that context. So they were careful at the same time that they were influenced by these important measures. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I have 3 related questions. First of all is, why are you particularly interested in the relationship between China, Japan, and Korea? And then, why do you particularly choose King Chォng-hŭi as your subject of study to learn this relationship? And the third one is, what are the major findings of the relationship between these 3 countries? Thank you.
Thank you. You'll make a very good historian in terms of using sources and materials. One of the reasons is Kim Chォng-hŭi writes voluminously, and we have manuscript material from him that survives even though he was in exile. And he read and kept up with the readings of the latest reformers. His student translator, in many ways, brought back very important books by Wei Yuan and others to him in order to deal with this kind of thing. So the documentation for Kim Chォng-hŭi for dissent is there. Others, it's much more difficult to find. It's also much more difficult to find for someone who's an actual Yangban, a Liangban, to have this kind of dissent. Many of the others were not Yangban, they were Pingmin, just normal people. And so in that context, the Yangban were much more careful to not get involved, so he's more straightforward on that. In terms of what we find, I think we find that the Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese know what's going on in their precincts. When Kim Chォng-hŭi returns from his first trip to China in 1810, the Koreans have also been visiting Tokugawa, Japan, and they've been finding out about Japanese scholarship. I'll be talking about that at the end of the week, next week, about Japanese editions of the Analects and what happened to them when they were transmitted back to China and printed in the Sikuquan Shu library of the Qianlong Emperor. They're very, very important materials that are involved there that we need to sort of stress and understand. So I'm trying to sort of get a good handle on these kinds of materials. What's also very important is the exchange of books and materials between Koreans and Chinese and Japanese. Many books had been lost in China in the Song Dynasty and thereafter in the periods of warfare and the like, and some of them survived in Korea. One very important mathematical text, the Sanxue Qimeng, the elementary mathematical learning, was recovered from Korea, and Kim Chォng-hŭi found it for Ran Yuan. Ran Yuan said, we need this particular book to reconstruct our traditional mathematics from the Song and the Yuan period, the so-called Si Yuan Shu and the Tian Wen Shu, the 4 unknowns or the single unknowns for algebraical equations. So Ran Yuan was given the edition that came from the Korean 15th century that had survived in Korea, and he immediately put it into the Huangqing Jingjie. And made that one of the important elements of the changing classical learning in the Huangqing Jingjie. And then he also gave Kim Chォng-hŭi a copy of the entire Huangqing Jingjie that was being published at that time in the Xuehaitang in Guangzhou, not too far from here. Ran Yuan was serving as the Liangguang Zongdu, the Governor General of Guangxi and Guangdong. So in that context, there was a great deal of exchange. There are other examples one could use to try to define these different aspects, but I think given the documentary density, the Kim Chォng-hŭi is a very good source to use. A historian would not throw away his sources if they're there. The danger is to invent them. Here, fortunately, we have them. We can use them, and we can make the story partly focus on Kim Chォng-hŭi in a period of exchange between China, Japan, and Korea.
But why are you interested first in this topic?
Well, I'm interested in taking a look at localism in the period of globalism. Very often when people deal with the global problem, they immediately reduce the local problems to less important phenomena. And they stress that we need to know the global situation affecting Korea, affecting China, affecting Japan. For example, Christianity. And they want to see how Christianity operates in these frameworks. But if you look carefully at the local situation, the way the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese dealt with the Christians, particularly the Jesuits, is always very different. The Japanese assassinated most of the Jesuits. The Koreans also tried to get rid of as many of them as possible and killed many of them. The Qing dynasty remarkably brought in Jesuits to work in the Astronomy Bureau and used their new teachings in mathematics and astronomy to translate them into Chinese and to use them in the 19th century. So there you have a regionally interesting reaction to a single global phenomena, the Christians and their role and influence in China, Japan, and Korea, when in fact China is much more open-minded about the Jesuits in coming to China than the Japanese were in Tokugawa, than the Koreans were, with some exceptions, and Kim Chong-hŭi was one of the exceptions, in Korea, Chosŏn, in the late 18th, early 19th century. So I'm looking at the problems of taking a global view and using it within the framework of a regional view. And I think one of the things we see is Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans at times look at each other in the same way, particularly when they look at the problems of corruption in the government in China, and then the problems of corruption in the Korean government, per se. So they see some parallels that are involved in that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Since I have read another book written by you about the civil examinations in late imperial China, I wonder if I can ask two questions. First, are these intellectuals from Japan and Korea allowed to participate in the civil examinations in Ming and Qing China? Since I've read some materials about Muslims in Inner Asia newly governed by the Qing Empire during the Qianlong era, that they are allowed to join the civil examinations. So I wonder if this kind of Korean scholars would be allowed to do so. And the second question would be about since these Korean intellectuals have so great communications and interaction with those scholars in China, I wonder if they have the same syllabus in their own civil examination in Korea, so that there might be something they can talk about, like in their examination or
Sure.
something like that.
Good questions. Thank you very much. With regard to the examinations in the early Ming, the Koreans were allowed to take the examinations. And in fact, they passed them, and they were given appointments in the early Ming dynasty. Ming Taizu, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty, gave them positions and allowed them to take office for short periods of time. Most of them returned to Korea and lived out their lives in Korea. So the examinations, the Koreans were particularly very good at passing them. You also should know that the Vietnamese were very good at passing them, and they had their own examinations like the Koreans. You're right to say the contexts were very different, and the papers were read in different kinds of ways, but in essence they were dealing with the 4 books and the 5 classics and the various historical materials that were part of the framework. So they used both of these collections, as did the Vietnamese. They gave different nuances to them, saw different interpretations to them, and in some frames the Japanese got involved as well. The Japanese knew about the examination questions in the 18th century. They didn't force anybody to take them, but many of the Japanese scholars of that time, particularly Ito Jinsai, said we must keep up. And in terms of the policy questions that were being introduced in the examinations in the Qianlong period and thereafter, they began to see that they had to do the same kind of thing with their scholarly world in the Japanese world, and they learned some of these issues from the Chinese about statecraft and what one needed to do about governance and what one needed about classics. And in many ways, the Tokugawa began to use the 4 books and the 5 classics to study different aspects of trading and morality and the like that they tried to get their government to accept in the late 18th and early 19th century. It's a very quiet voice, but it was a very interesting voice of the rise of an examination system in secret, indirectly through the shoguns in Edo in the period of, say, roughly from 1780 until about 1810 or so. So there was interaction all through that period of time. But the other side was the Koreans and the Vietnamese were free to choose what they wanted as part of the examinations, as long as they could justify their readings and their arguments about the 4 books and the 5 classics. When the Jesuits tried to do a similar kind of thing, the Qing in particular rejected all their views because they felt the Jesuits didn't understand the 4 books or the 5 classics and couldn't be taken seriously. But they took the Vietnamese, the Koreans, and also the Japanese in some ways indirectly as very serious scholars of the materials. And I'll be talking about that at the end of the lectures, the 3rd lecture.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Elman. I would like to ask a question because I think the previous lecture that you presented mentioned quite a lot about the input of Confucianism of the Chinese part towards like the influence to Korean or like Japanese understanding towards Confucianism itself. But I would like to ask one thing, because we all know that in terms of preservation of Confucianism, like in East Asia region, Korean or like Japanese are doing quite well. When we compare China, the current situation in China, it seems that Confucianism is no longer that significant. So what do you think like is the major contribution of like or done by the Koreans in terms of the preservation and advancement of understanding towards Confucianism?
Well, I mean, the communism and Confucianism did not go together for a long period of time. We are beginning to see efforts to communicate between the two groups. And more recently, the Communist Party has begun to borrow Juxi's ideas, borrow Neo-Confucian views and ideals, and also borrow the Guiyang commentary for notions of governance in a global environment where the Chinese are the center of the world again. So in other words, it's available for people, but it's quite true that after 1911, after the revolution and the continuation of the revolution, that Confucianism was blamed for everything. That Confucianism had failed to serve China well, and that a revolution was necessary in politics, in economy, in society, in governance. Everything was needed to be new. And I'll talk about that in the next lecture, how everything swung into China is bad, it's awful, and we need a revolution. The reason we have a revolution is because people argued Confucianism had failed, the economy had failed, political views had failed, and we needed to get rid of all those materials. That wasn't necessarily true, but that's what people believed, particularly in the May 4th period and thereafter. I think in the late 20th century into the early 21st century, people have begun to stop blaming Confucianism and seeing its uses. And so your uses here in Hong Kong of the kind of Xinya Xuyuan Jingshen is a continuation of some of those kinds of values and ideals that focus on Chen Mu's efforts to make Confucianism relevant to the 20th and 21st century. He tried to do that in Taiwan, and it succeeded up to a point in academic worlds, but it wasn't very successful among the common people. And common people were influenced more by the Ministry of Education and popular Western views of education in the 21st century. So I think it's very complicated, but I think for a period of time in the 20th century, the communists in particular attacked Confucianism as the enemy. Now they're wiping the slate clean and saying they were always in favor of Confucius.
Yeah.
Well, that wasn't true, but that's the way they make it appear.
I see.
So it's a complicated story.
Yeah, thank you very much.
The question from the dress circle? No?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'd like to invite you all to join me in thanking Professor Elman once again.
Once again, thank you, Professor Elman, and thank you, Professor Wong. New Asia College would like to thank Professor Elman for the lecture. May we invite Professor Henry Wong to present the souvenir to Professor Benjamin Elman. Thank you, professors. May we now invite Professor Elman and Professor Wong to take their leave. Students, please be seated as we will continue our assembly. Now, we will have the promotion by student organizations. May we first invite NA Singing Contest Organizing Committee.
Testing. 大家好啦，咁我係新唱17扣人新言鬧李成嘅籌委。咁新唱初賽呢，早前已經圓滿結束咗啦。咁好快呢，喺3月23號，即係下個星期4呢，就到我哋嘅新唱決賽啦。咁呢個一年一度嘅新亞盛事呢，又點可以冇你份呢？咁講咁耐，到底新唱有咩咁吸引啊？咁除咗有喺初賽突圍而出嘅參賽者之外呢，當然唔少得我哋今年請嚟嘅大星啦。咁決賽嘅參賽者喺初賽嘅決賽參賽者嘅初賽精華片段呢，已經 upload 咗去我哋嘅 Facebook page 度啦。咁而今年嘅嘉賓呢，可以話係人強馬壯同埋人山人海啊！我哋分別呢請咗 Super Moment 同埋 C All Star， 係咪聽到都忍唔住叫齊一家大細過嚟呢？咁就啱啦！大家可以喺星期一6點半火車站嚟到我哋嘅 counter， 又或者你有宿嘅，夜晚9點半嚟到我哋4宿嘅 counter 度揀位買飛，記得要揀位啊！咁有咁多星睇，咁到底幾錢啊？都係42蚊，42蚊有2個大星睇到話冇抵呢。咁今年呢，仍然會採用劃位嘅方法嘅，所以呢係真係早買早着數㗎。咁如果你而家望過嚟見到我嘅眼耳口鼻都好清楚嘅話呢，咁代表咩啊？代表你坐住個位呢，好大可能已經賣咗出去㗎啦。咁唔好再望啦，咁快啲拎個電話出嚟問下你一家大細姨媽姑姐啊、大歐眉、細歐眉、中童、小童、仔女啊、莊園又好，邊個都好啦，問佢嚟唔嚟啦？因為我哋要揀位㗎，快啲嚟攤位我哋嘅 counter 嗰度揀定位留定飛去買飛啦。記住係42蚊。希望我哋下次再見到你嘅時候，會再次喺呢一度 Surround Show Hall， 夜晚7點等你探索，到時見。
Now, let's invite the Student Union of New Asia College. Thank you.
喂，大家好啦，咁我哋係新一屆，亦都係第54屆香港中文大學沙書院學生會幹事會啊，我係新一屆嘅幹事長黃獎浩 JoJo 啦，咁希望大家可以繼續支持我哋新亞學生會。如果大家仲未清楚係咩嚟嘅，可以上 Facebook page 搜尋我哋新亞學生會啊，或 NASU 呢個 page 嘅。咁我呢度好多謝上年第53屆新學生會每一位幹事嘅付出同埋努力啦。佢哋無論喺校政、院政或者各項嘅福利同埋社會事務上咧，都提供咗好多，做咗好多唔同值得我哋參考嘅活動，佢哋俾我哋嚟緊嘅莊去參考嘅。喺度我代表我新一莊同埋各位去多謝佢哋每一位嘅付出，都希望佢哋喺卸任之後都可以享受翻佢哋有份建構嘅呢個新亞書院。咁我哋第54屆莊就以生命為名啦，咁最終嘅目標就係希望可以令到大家都視呢個新亞書院為佢哋生命之中嘅一部分。咁喺度都好想大家可以花少少時間聽一聽我嘅莊園介紹。我係候選幹事長黃俊浩啦，咁內務副幹事長陳維清同學，外務副幹事長盧樂培同學。我哋嘅秘書長梁俊宇同學，我哋嘅學術暨社會幹事方潔儀同學，福利幹事麥卓玲同學，宣傳幹事陳麗瑩同學。咁希望大家都多多支持我哋新一屆嘅學生會幹事會。好啦，咁嚟緊呢，大家都知選舉近啦。講緊嘅呢，就唔係呢個學生會嘅選舉，而係講緊呢個3月26號嘅特首選舉啦。咁為咗令到大家唔同同學都更加了解呢件事呢，咁我哋嚟緊呢就會舉辦一個相對與別不同啲嘅活動啦，就會喺呢個小巴萬大道舉行嘅。咁如果同學想關注多啲呢件事呢，都可以繼續留意翻我哋 Facebook page 都會有詳情公佈噶啦。可能有啲人覺得我哋比較離地啦，咁我哋而家講緊一啲絕對貼地嘅，就係關於同學2017至18年嘅宿費啊。話說咧，呢個3月1號咧，宿宣就召開咗呢個新一屆嘅宿舍事務委員會啦。咁其實同學而家交緊嘅宿費咧，今年16至17年交緊宿費咧，講緊係11170。另外大學校方仲會補貼多766蚊，即係其實每位同學實際嘅要交嘅宿費係11936。咁睇翻宿位嘅成本啦，呢個就係16至17同埋17至18年大學計出嚟嘅每個書院宿舍入面嘅成本嚟嘅。咁嚟緊嘅宿費成本咧就係12382。咁而書院亦都喺宿委會入面提出咗將呢個加幅就帶俾同學啦，就係下年佢哋提出12382呢個數嘅宿費嘅。但係 我哋幹事會同四宿走讀嘅同學商討完之後，都覺得呢個數太高啦。我哋希望係凍結咗個宿費佢嘅，所以最後我哋宿委會喺所有學生代表嘅支持下咧，都通過咗11936呢個決議，即係下年大學各位同學要交嘅宿費咧，都係11936。而宿委會咧都遲啲就會就呢個 propose 嘅宿費召開唔同嘅諮詢會，都希望同學到時有意見嘅同學可以去反映翻呢個意見嘅。咁其實喺會議入面咧，我都聽到有書院職員講到話，其實如果就算同學因為呢個議決嘅通過宿費咧，就係由所有嘅學生代表支持投票之下去通過嘅。咁我而聽到書院職員入面都喺當中提到咧話，就算呢個會通過咗，書院都有權去唔做呢樣嘢嘅。咁我就有少少唔明好明咁設立學生代表喺入面嘅原意喺邊啦，都有少少嘅啫係。咁就希望其實書院都正視翻，可以正視翻所有學生代表同埋學生組織嘅關係，嚟緊同所有書院同所有學生組織同學生會一齊建構一個更加好嘅新亞書院，了解多啲同學嘅意見啦。好，咁我要宣布係咁多，唔該晒。
Finally, we will have the college announcements. May we invite Dr. Elman, Associate Dean of Students. Thank you.
都唔阻大家時間，咁我簡單即係提翻大家幾樣嘢嘅，就係暑期實習嗰個計劃今年嘅，你哋要留意個截止日期係3月7號。咁頭先同我聽到咧 Professor Elman 咧，佢咁精彩嘅演說，如果你仲想繼續聽咧，其實聽日咧就會喺呢個中央圖書館3點鐘，咁其實係公開嘅演說嚟嘅。咁仲有一場咧就係下個禮拜3都喺大學 YIA 嘅4點鐘，亦係公開俾同學自由參加嘅。咁咧仲有咧，如果你想喺暑假報一啲短期嘅海外課程啊，或者交流，你想獲得資助咧，你要留意呢個學生資助計劃啦。咁就截止日期咧都係喺4月中，4月19號。咁仲有，如果你係學生團體，你亦得到書院嘅資助，咁你留意咧，5月31號咧就係限期要即係遞交文件咧就撥款支銷嘅過程要做啦。咁最後啦，就係咧呢個3月10號星期五，我哋書院咧影畢業相，咁咧就請同學留意啦。咁睇翻即係如果你係有幫手啊，睇翻嗰個 schedule， 咁同我哋一齊影幅相留念啦。咁我報告係咁多，多謝各位。
This is the end of the 594th Biweekly Assembly of New Asia College of CUHK. Students, please be reminded that before you leave, you must return the completed attendance sheet with your name, major of study, year of study, and student ID number clearly written on. To collection box for record of attendance and collection of opinions. Thank you for your cooperation. Goodbye.